Welcome to today's episode, where we delve into the intersection of music, activism, and the quest for justice with the renowned British Iraqi hip hop artist and political campaigner Lowkey. Known for his sharp lyrical prowess and deep commitment to social causes, Lowkey stands as a vocal advocate for peace, equity, and human rights. His involvement with prominent organizations such as the Stop the War Coalition, Palestine Solidarity Campaign, the Campaign for the Nuclear Disarmament, and the Peace and Justice Project founded by Jeremy Corbyn underscores his dedication to effecting positive change through both his music and activism. Serving as an advisor to declassified UK, Lowkey plays a crucial role in shedding light on the shadowy operations of the Ministry of Defence and the British intelligence services. His voice has resonated in diverse venues, from the esteemed Oxford Union to the iconic Royal Albert Hall, and even the vibrant stages of Glastonbury, bringing critical issues to the forefront of public consciousness. Today, we explore with Lowkey we explore Loki's journey, his insights on the war on Gaza, and the powerful role of activism in the West, particularly in the UK, in supporting the Palestinian cause. Join us as we uncover the stories behind the music and the movement with Loki. Hello, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here.
Thank you. So we're going to start with the motivation for justice, reflecting on the diverse roles you've embraced from music to activism. What pivotal moments or influences propelled you towards dedicating yourself to the pursuit of justice and defense of human rights?
Well, Bell Hooks once said that we must aspire to love justice more than we love any aspect of our own identity. And I feel for me, that has been a journey towards that realization. Of course, people are produced by their own backgrounds. And so my own parents' political journeys certainly had an influence on me. I was fortunate to some extent that I grew up in a house that had Franz Fanon on the bookshelf. My father was a political campaigner here who was arrested in the 70s, anti-racist campaigner at a famous incident called the Battle of Lewisham, which was where racists from the National Front were coming to the community of Lewisham, which was well known for people from the Caribbean living there and still is until this day. And really, you had this wave of white nationalist racism to try and push back the tide of history. And so the Battle of Lewisham was one of those events. And, my dad going through that and then growing up in the house around these political experiences, it obviously, to some extent, cultivated within me a critical thinking when approaching the issues of the day. But then, of course, I grew up in the war on terror generation, which meant that I was racialized in a particular way within the society. Um, the aspects of the state which adopted a hostile posture towards people like me, not just through legislation, but also through the kind of propaganda that was pumping out day to day, through our experiences within the society, within my own community. I'm from a community where we have a rich history of activism, largely from people that came from the Caribbean in the 50s. Again, they faced racism, but also resisted and established key celebrations of Caribbean culture in the city, like the Notting Hill Carnival.
Mhm.
Um, but then also, you have on top of that, one of the most radicalizing forces in my life was the Grenfell Tower fire. Grenfell was a tower which was next door to me. And in 2017, a fire started in the building from a fridge. And because of the cladding and the insulation on the building, the fire spread across the building at an alarming rate, and it killed 72 people, including one of my friends. And I witnessed it. And then we saw basically the way in which the state could not absorb or assimilate the form of social justice that we would require. So, in a situation where corporation has been found to put dangerous material on a building that led to people dying, 18 of them children, and dying in a myriad of ways. It wasn't just asphyxiation from the fire. A young boy, Isaac Paulos, was trampled on the stairs. Mohammed Al Hajj Ali, a Syrian refugee, fell from the 15th floor. So we saw all of that. And this was in a place that was very intimate to me. Grenfell Tower was somewhere that I'd spent a lot of time in and around. I had music videos shot inside the tower. The football pitches were somewhere that all of us played. And so these incidents, like the invasion of Iraq, like the war on terror, and like Grenfell, they served to radicalize me more, but also push me towards a place where I understood, okay, politics, as Aristotle said, is the art of the possible. So within these boundaries that we have set for us and are carefully policed and curated, we have a certain level of possibility. And it's very small. And it's got smaller across my lifetime, actually, in this country. But with art, it's like the art of the impossible, because within your art, you can, and I'm not overly optimistic. It's like Amin al-Habibi has the phrase, السعيد
متشائل.
متفائل لا متشائل صحيح so it's like when you combine what Gramsci's called the pessimism of intellect and the optimism of will, you have this way of viewing the world, which understands the limitations of what can be done, but also finds ways to circumvent those limitations. And so for me, essentially art, it served that purpose. And I'm not idealistic about how it can change things. You know, after Grenfell, I produced several songs about it that involved the whole community. And we reached a lot of people, but did we change the existing political dynamics? We did not. When it comes to the war on terror, I've done several songs. Did that, you know, while they reached millions of people, they did not change the political dynamics. I think what they partly served to do was establish certain understandings of what was happening as more generalized. So young people may, of a certain generation in this country, have certain slogans and certain phrases that can come from songs, which then form the understanding among a generation. But how that interacts with the lived reality and the material conditions, I'm still unclear on.
Actually, I had a question regarding this part. It's regarding advocacy and activism to begin with. Could you share how your involvement in the Palestinian cause and the broader anti-war movement reflects in your actions and advocacy? Specifically, what initiatives or efforts do you consider most crucial in emphasizing the urgency to halt conflicts?
Let's be clear. In the issue of Palestine,
Mhm.
Britain has a historical role, and I mean that in two senses. I don't just mean the Balfour Declaration, the 1936, or the Wingate setting up Zionist militias that would go on to become the Israeli military. I don't just mean the arming of the Israelis with 500 Centurion tanks in 1967 to carry out the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza by the British. What I mean is that the communities here have a role that can be played to
Mhm.
close that gap. Now, if we look at the situation we're in today, it's the perception of the majority of humanity that Israel is carrying out a genocide in Gaza. We can say that the majority of states in the world have a position which is completely at odds with the main power brokers in the equation. The
Mhm.
majority of states in the world do not designate Palestinian armed resistance as a form of terrorism. The majority of populations in the world are represented by governments that do not designate those organizations. Now, Britain does, the EU does, United States does, Japan does. That's less than 1 billion people. Russia doesn't, China doesn't, Turkey doesn't, Pakistan doesn't, Venezuela doesn't, uh, even Switzerland doesn't. What's more neutral than Switzerland? You're talking about over 1 billion people represented by governments that don't view it in that way. Now, our role here as a country where you had 10 arms sites for Elbit Systems, which is Israel's largest arms company, producing weapons and exporting them to Israel, to Palestine. Now, we have established a movement here by the name of Palestine Action. Now, Palestine Action has succeeded in shutting down permanently 2 Israeli arms sites in this country. One in Oldham, where the subsidiary of Elbit Systems, Ferranti Technologies, was, and the other, the Mekteb, or kind of headquarters office of Elbit Systems in London. Both of those were closed permanently by Palestine Action. Now, what has been the difference? We didn't do it through marches. We did it through direct action, entering into those premises and shutting them down repeatedly, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. Now, that hasn't been easy. There have been measures taken to suppress that movement from many different directions. However, we have exploited the key contradiction that we're talking about here. And that contradiction is Britain, as a signatory to the Arms Trade Treaty, must not sign off on exports to a country if it has, quote unquote, reason to believe that what they are exporting may be used for violations of international humanitarian law. Thus, how do we square this circle? Britain as a state, according to its own laws, should not be exporting weapons to Israel. So therefore, when we act to exploit that contradiction in British law, and we've seen plenty of precedents of people entering the courts and walking out and going into the courts accused of criminal damage, for example, but they argue in the court that war crimes, including now the crime of genocide, are far more harmful than criminal damage. And there are juries in the country. Ultimately, the British justice system, you have the police, you have the CPS, you have the judiciary, and then you have the juries. And the juries are made up of the general population. So the general population will look at a situation and say, okay, you put paint on an arms factory. What do I view as more harmful to human society? Paint on an arms factory or the arms inside the arms factory? And so for that reason, the things that have been achieved by Palestine Action haven't actually been achieved anywhere else in the world, really, apart from Derry in the
If
north
I
of
may
Ireland.
interrupt you, I'm really curious to know about the costs of such activism acts. I mean, advocating for Palestine in general has its own consequences in the entire, in the West and in the UK in particular, ranging from public scrutiny to potential impacts on your own career and personal security. How do you weigh these risks against the imperative to speak out?
I look at the picture of a teenage boy who was walking to get food and who was shot by an Israeli sniper, and then his brother who came to help him and was also shot and killed by an Israeli sniper. I look at the video and picture of Muhammad al-Dhurra. I look at the eyes of Wa'il al-Dahduh when he says, "Intaqamu fil awlad." I look at these experiences of these people and I say to myself, what type of human being would I be? How would I be able to explain to my grandchildren my silence during this period when thinking of these unbelievable scenes? And I consider us to have a moral obligation and also now legal obligation with the process in the ICJ to disable this machine in whatever way we can. And any wound for the Palestinian cause is a badge of honor. The I'm not afraid of them. We spent years in the Corbyn years, unfortunately, um, afraid. When Jeremy Corbyn was the leader of the Labour Party, and we put a lot of effort into trying to get him elected as Prime Minister, the Israel lobby was able to bully many of us and push people. They established a hierarchy of political subjectivity in the country, which said that if you tick certain boxes, you do not have access to the political process. You cannot belong to a particular political party. You and it's really interesting the sort of mechanism that was played out by the right wing media in that stage, because it had a sort of symbiotic relationship with the security state. In that, first and foremost, the case will be built in public. So the newspapers will build the case that this person is beyond acceptable um, uh, sort of acceptability as a political actor, and then either the Labour Party and or the police then work to stigmatize that person even more. But none of those consequences. I don't fear any of those consequences. I welcome those consequences. I welcome those consequences. It proves that we are being effective at a time, at a time of the great crimes of history. The people who can hold their head up the highest are the people that suffered for their political positions at that time.
What
Now,
are what
I'm
are
not saying that people should embrace suffering. I'm
Mhm.
saying that we shouldn't fear it.
um
Especially those of us in particular political theaters which are removed from Israel's jurisdiction. With my case, for example, Israel targets my music on the back of the idea of it being incitement, right? Okay.
mhm.
In Palestine, you have people daily being put in jail for the crime of incitement on social media. So what they're trying to do is externalize this understanding that they've created in Palestine and establish it as a norm in another country. Um, it's they used Palestine as a laboratory really to develop these methods of control, and now they export them in different ways to other governments in the world also.
I actually was also curious about other significant outcomes that have emerged from the activism efforts that you have. I mean, you've discussed already I think it's the Stop the War Coalition thing about the the arming factory, or so. Are there any others that you can highlight during this time during the war against Gaza?
Well, Stop the War Coalition mainly work on demonstrations. So they
Mm-hmm,
were responsible for the, some say, 2 to 3 million person march in February 2003 to stop the Iraq War. That's an element of the political activity, but my belief is we need to move from a more passive state into a more active state.
mm-hmm,
At this stage, we need to escalate our activities, and we need to look at the particularly the situation of arms, because I think that's where Israel's weakest.
mm-hmm.
It's demonstrations do what they do, and they're good and they have potential, but like I say, Palestine action and direct action against the arms factories has proven to be very effective, and also is very very difficult for them to defend.
Okay, so maybe one last question. Looking ahead to the aftermath of the Gaza, um, to the war on Gaza, what strategies are you developing to leverage and build on the achievements thus far, if there are an actual things that we can call achievements? And how do you plan to continue your advocacy and activism in the new phase?
Well, for instance, since Palestine Action was founded, 77 investors have pulled out of Elbit Systems.
Hmm.
Elbit Systems UK, the company, has dropped 17% in the value of its shares. The British Ministry of Defence has cancelled £280 million worth of contracts with this Israeli arms company. So there are clear achievements in terms of what Palestine Action has been able to do. But I think now it's about moving people from essentially what is liberal misleadership in the movement in this country, which deals with the British government as if it's a neutral arbiter. It deals with the
Hmm.
British government as if a direct participant in the war is capable of calling for a ceasefire, which the British government is not. The British government is a direct participant alongside the United States with this war on the region. Um, and we need clarity about that. And people need to be aware of that. And I think when you understand that, the United States, for example, as has been published by The Intercept, had Air Force officers helping with targeting on this war, okay, on this genocidal campaign. How does it make sense to then appeal to these governments to call for a ceasefire when they're participants in the war, and constantly framing them as potentially neutral arbiters? Is I can't tell you how naive I believe it is. They're not going to do that because they work hand in glove. We are ruled by a trilateral security state, which is Israel, United States, and Britain. They outsource key functions to each other. So, for instance, here, the Israelis, through a company called Celebrite, which is an Israeli intelligence firm founded by alumni of Unit 8200 in the Israeli military, they hack phones for the British police. Okay.
Mhm.
The British train the Palestinian Authority for the Israelis. The Americans carry out all manner of services for each of those states. So when you understand those three states as operating as one in the region, as we see with the bombing of Yemen, with the bombing of Iraq, the bombing of Syria now, they are working hand in glove on the same project. Yes, there are nuances, and yes, there are degrees of disagreement on,
Mhm.
mainly on stylistic disagreements, not substantial disagreements. The Israel has essentially told the world that it's taken ownership of the population of Gaza, and it's
Mhm.
taken ownership of the population of Al-Dhafar. And that, according to the world, they have stood back and said Israel can do with them what it wants. Britain, Canada, and Germany will continue to export components for weapons to the Israelis. The US will continue to export the machines themselves to the Israelis and help them with targeting those strikes. Um, Clarity, I think, is the most important point, because before you get to effective action, you have to establish clarity about what is actually happening. So, when you look at the period of World War One, you had established funnily enough, the Nobel. So Alfred Nobel, who went on to
Mhm.
found the Nobel Peace Prize, part of his motivation for that is believed to be his guilt over the production of munitions. And he had a Nobel munitions conglomerate in World War One, which
Mhm.
included both German and British companies. So both these German and British companies were in the same corporate structure for the first 2 years of World War One, meaning that British companies benefited when British people died, and German companies profited when German people died. But 2 years into World War One, that was dissolved because
Mhm.
it was too much of a conflict of interest. So at that stage, Britain needed to produce smokeless gunpowder, and it consulted a scientist from Manchester by the name of Chaim Weizmann. Now,
Mhm.
Chaim Weizmann came up with the formula to produce acetone using starch. And this was known as the Weizmann method. And so it was exported then to Canada and to the United States. Now, Chaim Weizmann is the individual that wrote the Balfour Declaration for Arthur Balfour. He was an Israel lobbyist, and then later on down the line, one of the first leaders of the Zionist entity. Now, Britain has always had this relationship on the basis of munitions with the Israelis. There are other aspects to it. There is the economic aspect, but there's
Mhm.
also the extent to which Britain today as a state, it was part of the, you could call it the Unit 8200, Unit 81 revolution, which
Okay.
happened, whereby these units in the Israeli military were seen as so successful at managing and policing the Palestinians that in 2012, according to an article in Calculus Tech, um, Netanyahu set a policy which was to move individuals from Unit 8200 and Unit 81 into private companies. And
Mm-hmm.
then, in that way, Israel would achieve greater visibility of what other countries were doing by other countries then outsourcing their key state functions to these companies. And so what you have is so many aspects of the British state are now carried out by companies set up by alumni of these Israeli military units. So what can you say about the issue of sovereignty? What is the integrity of these supposedly sovereign institutions? And so I think Britain is in a position that many other countries are in, but particularly vis-a-vis Israel, it's also
Mm-hmm.
about this entrenched alliance between Britain and the United States and Israel. You've got 12,000 British soldiers in 12,000 US soldiers in Britain. So the relationship comes with a lot of overlaps
Mm-hmm.
and entanglements.
I really hope that we had much longer time because this is really interesting and eye-opening. But I'm afraid that I have to now end the episode. Thank you so much, Loki, for being with us today. And I hope you can be with us in other episodes. Thank you.